when I think about America's legacy and America's history, this day I come to the floor with my eyes and my memory and my heart full of the last 2 days of saying goodbye to America's greatest living hero up until the time of his death, Colonel Bud Day. Colonel Bud Day, just a moment. This is one image I would point out, Mr. Speaker, of the Bud Day that I knew, the man that I had the privilege to call a friend, the man that I admired, at our time, a living American hero. Colonel Bud Day was, up until the time of his death, the most decorated living American hero. I believe we had to go back to General MacArthur to find someone who was more decorated than Bud Day. To put this in a short capsule, Mr. Speaker, Colonel Bud Day served in 3 wars. He volunteered as a high school senior when he heard that there was going to be a draft. He abhorred the thought of having to draft people to serve our country in a time of war, and he immediately went down to the courthouse to see the Marine recruiter. He served in World War II. He served in the Korean War. He served in the Vietnam War. He became a prisoner of war and was repatriated and brought back to the United States and with his family in 1973. Bud Day received the Medal of Honor. He received 70-some other medals. Every available combat medal that was available to him in the theaters that he fought in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam had been awarded to Bud Day. Bud Day was the one who, in the Hanoi Hilton, in one other POW's cell, is where they brought John McCain, when John McCain was in a body cast, has been expressed, was rattling around inside a body cast weighing about 75 pounds. They brought John McCain in and threw him on Bud Day's bunk. And the 2 individuals began to heal John McCain back to health. This life of this man is full of service in 3 wars, and he served our country through, as I add them up, through the decade of the 40s in World War II, the decade of the 50s in the Korean War, the decade of the 60s, and the early 70s in the Vietnam War. He came back and continued to serve his country up until nearly the 80s in the service, and then went into service in practicing law in Florida. So that would be through the 90s, and as recently as just a few days ago, he won another case shortly before he died. Bud Day was a fighter. He was a scrapper. He was an American patriot. And Mr. Speaker, I come here to the floor today to tell a more thorough narrative of Colonel Bud Day. And I want to point out first that much of that narrative is in one of 2 books that are of and about Bud. This one is by him. And when you read it, it's Duty, Honor, Country, Colonel George Bud Day, Warrior, Lawyer. And when you read Duty, Honor, Country, you hear the flavor and the thread of his conversation. This is, you'll see and read books that are written by ghostwriters, and they will go in and interview the extraordinary person and put that into narrative form, and you can read the book, and when you read that, you don't always get the feel and the flavor of the character. In this one, I see the language that Bud Day used constantly coming up, and it's flowery language. It's actually almost always very tasteful language, but he saw images that were I'll say, captured in his mind's eye, that he kept in his memory for years, and he expressed them in this book. And going back to read it a second time upon the occasion of his death, the personality of Bud Day emerges in this book, Mr. Speaker. And yet, so I'd like to go down through the history of the life of Colonel Bud Day. And I was able to, as I said, call him a friend. We were hunting buddies. We spent a lot of time out in the fields of Iowa together with a shotgun, stopping to rest, talking politics, talking history, talking the history of war, refighting some wars while we were at it. But the beginning of his life was in February 24th, 1925. And Colonel Day was then, of course, George Bud Day was born in Sioux City, Iowa. He went to Riverside High School, and he's born in Riverside, which is a suburb of Sioux City, and he went to Central High School in Sioux City, where he learned that there was when he learned that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and he saw that in 1942, remember that was December 7th, 1941, in 1942, when he heard there was going to be a draft, Bud Day decided that he would go down and sign up, and he saw the Marine recruiter and became a Marine, and then from that point he served 2.5 years in the South Pacific, and he came back home in 1945 and went to college at Morningside College there in Sioux City, and shortly after that went up to the University of South Dakota in Vermillion, South Dakota, and received his law degree up there. By 1949, Marine Bud Day had an undergraduate degree at Morningside College and a Juris Doctorate law degree from the University of South Dakota, where he thought he would go and practice law. But he also served in the Iowa National Guard from 1950, and he attended flight school because he wanted to fly. So, therefore, in 1951, the Air Force called Bud Day to active duty, and he was a fighter pilot in the Korean War. He served 2 tours as a fighter pilot in the Korean War. That experience there, growing up in Sioux City, anchored him to the 185th Air Guard that is based today in Sioux City. He maintained his relationships with the people that serve there, with the airmen that serve out of the 185th in Sioux City. Sioux City was always his home. He kept his contacts there, but he transferred his family down to Pensacola, Florida, in that area because there is a lot of military down there, and of course it's a great place to live. I came back from there last night, having joined in the funeral and the procession to the cemetery for Colonel Bud Day. But after his Korean War experience, where he served 2 tours, he decided to make the Air Force a career. One of the things he did was he was deployed to the base at Niagara in New York, which he euphemistically called Nigeria, but they loved it up there, and he built good bonds with people and strong bonds, and he took his flying hours up, and with those flying hours that he had, he became one of the most experienced pilots to be deployed to Vietnam. And so he anticipated that he would retire in 1968, but then Major Day volunteered for a tour in Vietnam, and he was assigned to the 31st Tactical Fighter Wing at Toi Ho Air Base, and that was in April of 1967. There he commanded the wing called the Misty wing, and that was because Bud Day named them so. Misty was his favorite song. And they flew missions over North and South Vietnam, and many of them, the most dangerous missions by far, were over North Vietnam. And on a mission over North Vietnam, in an F-100, it was they were spotting and locating surface-to-air missiles that had freshly been placed there, Russian surface-to-air missiles that had the capability of taking down B-52s. As they located the Russian surface-to-air missile site, they were hit by enemy fire. Some say it was an enemy missile. In Bud's book, he says he thinks they took a direct hit from a 37-millimeter anti-aircraft weapon. But in any case, it hit the fuselage of the F-100 and took their flight down, and he had to, as he said, punch out. And there he was imprisoned then, immediately captured by the North Vietnamese, and was imprisoned for 5 years and 7 months, and became the highest-ranking officer in that prison. And so he commanded people like John McCain during that period of time. But throughout all that long ordeal that our American prisoners of war served in they euphemistically called it the Hanoi Hilton, throughout that long ordeal, Bud maintained his spirit, he maintained his strength, and he gave encouragement to the others who were there, and he defied his captors in a way that I think amazed the people that served there with him. When he was released on March 14th, 1973, he was reunited with his wife, Dory, and their 4 children, Steve, George, and the 2 daughters. And then he was presented the Medal of Honor in by Medal of Honor by Gerald Ford, President Ford, in 1976. In all, as I said, over 70 medals, every medal available to him, a combat medal from each field that he served in, each war, each theater. And he was the only person ever to have been awarded both the Medal of Honor and the Air Force Cross. And then Bud Day retired from active duty in 1977, resumed practicing law in Florida. And one of the issues that he took on was TRICARE. And then in the 90s, he saw that the Clinton administration was starting to back away from the commitment that if you serve 20 years in the armed forces, you would receive half your pay as your pension for life and medical care for life. That was the deal. That was the agreement. And he was appalled that the federal government was starting to move away from that agreement. So Bud Day, ever the fighter, ever the scrapper, ever the lawyer, went to court and put together a class action lawsuit to force the federal government to keep their word with our warriors. And most of that was designed to benefit America's greatest generation, the World War II veterans. And we've lost so many of them since that period of time. But as Bud Day drove that lawsuit and worked his way up through the courts, and he got all the way to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court refused to hear the case, refused to grant cert, as the ruling was. And so the indomitable Colonel Bud Day, Medal of Honor recipient, decided, okay, if we can't get what's right done in the courts, I'll go to Congress. So he took this argument to Congress, and if I have my dates right, it was in 2002 that Congress passed TRICARE. We had a good number of debates on TRICARE since then. I don't believe we would have TRICARE at all if it weren't for Colonel Bud Day. And yesterday I parted with his family, his Doris, or Dory, as he affectionately called the Viking. And when I read in his book when he talked about her ice blue eyes, I saw them sad yesterday, but they're still bright, and they're still ice blue, and there's still a sparkle behind the tears. And the family is strongly together with Steve and George Jr. and Sandra and Sonia and 14 grandchildren. And it was a ceremony and a service like no other for a man that they'll never know another like, Colonel Bud Day. And of these experiences, I've looked through a number of articles, and recognizing, Mr. Speaker, that I probably can't be the best author to commemorate the life of a great, iconic man that has captured this country. So I will take you down through a bit of a narrative from a story. And here's one of the things that Bud Day did. I'll just take you through the narrative of the way he treated death multiple times. Now, remember, this is a man that signed up for the Marine Corps in 1942, Mr. Speaker, and was able to come back from 2.5 years being deployed to the South Pacific and get his college undergrad degree and his law degree, went into the Iowa Guard because he wanted to fly, and he did fly, and he volunteered to go to Korea, and there served 2 tours flying a fighter bomber or a bomber over Korea, and then was while he was flying training missions, he was deployed different places, Georgia, for example, and then over to England, a base in England. And here are the number of times that Bud Day cheated death. The first one that I recall was when he was flying out of a base in Georgia, and a fighter aircraft had the fuel doors were open, and he had a leak, and there was a plane that was flying next to him that said, "You've got a leak." It looked like it was a fatal mechanical error. He didn't have enough altitude to bail out, and he didn't have enough power to land, so he wasn't going to be able to sustain his power to land. And Bud Day gave you an example of what he was going to be able to do for a lifetime, and that is, in quick thinking, the kind of thing that a more experienced pilot, in fact, pilots would likely be trained on this after they found out what Bud Day had done, and that is that he did the only thing that he could do that would save his life. He put the nose of that plane down, knowing that if he could get to 170 knots, that those sucker doors would close, and if they closed, it would shut off the risk of the fire. And so he put that nose down in a courageous way, and right before he got to the treetops, he was able to reach 170 knots. In doing so, the sucker doors closed, and he was able to stabilize the aircraft and land it safely. That was the first time that's recorded that Colonel Bud Day cheated death. Not very long after that, he was flying out of a base in England, and the name of the base, I think, is a pretty important one. And I know that I marked it here in my notes, Mr. Speaker. But it was and I'm going to find that in a second. But it was, okay, excuse me, Mr. Speaker, the name of the base was Wethersfield, England, and it was just pretty interesting that the uniqueness of that. But as Bud Day flew out of England, and he had another situation where he had an engine fire at low altitude, and there was no ability to set the plane down. He got it on a course where it would be away from population, and as he was in a lower altitude, around 500 or so feet, the only choice he really had was to eject. So he ejected, and he looked up, and he said, "Where's the chute? Where is the chute?" It was a no chute, no opening, no blossom, no orange blossom, and he joked that fighter pilots or plane pilots will often argue, if your chute doesn't work, just take it back. And here is a man in a no-chute bailout of a jet aircraft, trailing down through the skies with the chute not opening, no blossom, just trailing down through. He went through the timber in England, the pine timber in England, and if any of us, Mr. Speaker, remember when Rambo jumped out of the helicopter and went through the trees and survived that fall, I don't know where the inspiration came for that scene in Rambo, but when I think of this happening to Colonel Bud Day, this man survived a no-chute bailout as the chute wouldn't open, and as it strung down through the skies, he went into the pine tree and bounced off the branches, and as those branches began to break his fall, some of the chute, the threads on the chute, the cords, slowed down a little bit on the branches, and he hit the ground. He hit the ground hard. He broke his ankle. He was injured in other places, but he was alive. The first person to survive a no-chute bailout of a jet aircraft. He did so in England in 1957. It was the second time he cheated death. The third time that he cheated death was in a 0-0 landing. And it was only 5 months after he had gone through his no-chute bailout. Now remember, this is a man that had the presence of mind to put the nose down on a fighter aircraft and head toward the ground, knowing that if he didn't reach that speed, that 170 knots, he was not going to be able to survive that flight. And to pull it up right above the trees, have the airspeed that he needed to get the sucker doors closed, to stabilize the aircraft, and to land it. And then here we are, not that long later, to be flying in England and have to bail out of a burning aircraft and go through and not have your chute open. And what did he say? Well, he expressed that it was an old Royal Air Force expression. He said that, I thought out loud, I bought the farm. What a lousy way to go. But he went through the trees, and he looked up and he said, flyers have an old bad joke about parachutes. If it doesn't open, take it back. There are not many members of that Take It Back Club. Colonel Bud Day was one of those members. And then the ejection, it was from an F-84, and it was the first in Air Force history for anyone that should survive from it. And Colonel Bud Day said, God must be saving me for something. In fact, his wife said to him, God must be saving you for something. And it was less than 6 months later that he was flying out of Wethersfield Royal Air Force Station in England, and they took off to go get some parts. They were cleared by the weather. The weather cleared. It was supposed to open up and stay open across Europe and the alternating landing forces that they had. But instead, the fog socked in. The visibility socked down to zero. The ceiling went to zero. And Bud Day said the weather was so bad that not even the birds flew in it. But they flew that F-80, that F-80C, and they were hoping the weather would reverse itself. His co-pilot was Bill Moore, known affectionately as Billy Moore. And so they had a choice. With everything socked in, they decided to turn back and go back to the Wethersfield airstrip, because that's the one they knew the best. That's the one that didn't have a lot of urban areas around it or a lot of housing. They had a pretty much clear approach to landing, and if they didn't make it, it was less likely that they would kill other people other than themselves. So they turned and went back to Wethersfield. And Bud Day is thinking, I don't want to bail out of this plane again. My ankle's just healing up from the last time my chute didn't open. So I want to come in and land this. And Billy Moore agreed it was the best choice that they could make. So they approached the landing strip, and as they approached it, this is a complete instrument landing with zero visibility and zero ceiling, and it was black as it could be. And the first approach, Bud said to his co-pilot Billy Moore, "You take the controls, I'll watch. And if I can see the runway, I'll take the controls from you the instant right before we land, and I'll land it." because Bud sitting in the front was the guy that could see the land of the runway. And so as they made that first approach, right before they would have made, I'll just say, touchdown and impact was an unknown, what that would be at the time. Right before they touched down, Bud Day saw that they were off the side of the runway. He saw a light on the side of the runway. He said, pull it back up. So they back up. And they went back around again, and they adjusted the radar again. And as they approached, a complete instrument landing, zero ceiling, zero visibility. Right before impact, right before they touched, Bud had said to Billy Moore, pull it back up. But that instant he realized they were lined up, and within just an instant of making contact with the runway, Bud Day took the controls and set that plane down. And it was the first 0-0 landing that they had survived. And he said that he said to Billy Moore, his co-pilot, he said, good show, pal. That was about as scary as it's going to get. I think we owe the radar controllers a beer. That tells you something about the spirit of this man. He said, I didn't want to bail out again. My leg and back are still sore from the last bailout. And you know, Bill, we may be the only pilots living today that have made a zero visibility, zero ceiling landing. And I think that turned out to be true. Later on, Bud Day volunteered then for combat duty in Vietnam, where he went on to command the squadron there. And as they were flying over that SAM site, that surface-to-air missile site, his captain was Corwin Kippenham of Amana, Iowa. Two Iowans together in that flight as they were hit and shot down on that day. They punched out. Bud Day was taken prisoner immediately. There was a third time he cheated death when they took a direct hit on the fuselage of that plane. And as he bailed out, this time his chute did open. But when it opened, it settled him down in the location where he was immediately taken captive. And his co-pilot, Kip, as he was known, was rescued right away. As Bud Day is on the ground looking up, there was an American helicopter that was hovering off at a close distance. They were looking for him, and he was in the trees, and they couldn't see him, but Bud could see the helicopter. And standing in the side of that helicopter door was his co-pilot with a rifle in his hand. They were looking to go get Bud Day. If they'd have seen him, they would have been able to recover him. But of course, that didn't happen, and he was put into captivity. So 3 times he cheated death, and as they beat him and as they tortured him, as they put him in a hole, he had his arm broken in 3 places. He had other injuries from the bailout. He'd hit the side of the plane on the way out and suffered those injuries. But they drove him and marched him through the villages in what they would like to have called a march of shame. But he was put under guard by a young Vietnamese, a teenager, whom Bud Day feigned that he was hurt badly. It was hard for him to walk. His knee was bad. His arm was broken 3 places. But he feigned that he was worse than he was, and he noticed that his captor would go off and talk to another guard because he believed that Bud could not move, could not get out of the hole that he was in, and that he wouldn't be able to travel. So he was a relaxed kind of a guard that wasn't really paying attention. Bud recognized that. He exploited that, and he feigned his injuries to be, it was bad, but he feigned them to be worse than they were. And as he did so, that guard got more and more relaxed. And after several days, Bud saw his opportunity. They were going to move him then on up to North Vietnam to the Hanoi Hilton is what it sounded like. There was some expression the guard had drawn a picture into the dirt of a Jeep, and that said that they were going to transport him. So they went in and tied his legs together with a cord, and they left him there. Bud Day knew that within hours or a day or so, they were going to come and get him, and once he went to the next stage of his captivity, each day that goes by, it gets harder and harder to escape. And so, as the guard went over to talk to his friend and had his back turned, Bud Day was able to untie the cords that tied his legs together, even though he only had one arm to do it and the other one broken in 3 places. When he did that, he had to pick a time that he thought the guard was as relaxed as possible, and he got out of that hole, and he headed out through the jungle to try to get down to the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, and to try to get then across the DMZ, cross a river, swim across a river, and then try to get into American hands that looked like it was going to be a long trip, and it was. Bud Day had a canteen. He had some water in it. He was able to refill that sometimes from water that was captured from rainwater and banana leaves that he would stop and refill his canteen. He went for days without eating, days without thinking about eating. He was so focused on avoiding the V, as he called them, the North Vietnamese military, but also the Viet Cong. And as he's traveling through North Vietnam, traveling through enemy territory, he had to be ever alert to maintain hiding and travel at night part of the time for the first couple, 3 days of his trip, because that was the only way it would be safe. But to try to navigate at night through the canopy of the jungle and try to follow trails that you don't know where they go is a very, very difficult task. And to keep his mind on task as he got weaker and weaker was a struggle that is something that is so impressive to see that he was able to hold it together. And he wouldn't have said that he held it together. He went up and down through delirium, and he would discipline his mind back to focusing on staying alive, because he remembered his beloved wife, Dory. He remembered his children. He remembered the people that he flew with, the Misty pilots and the Misty team that was out there. He prayed to God to come and save him. The 23rd Psalm was his favorite psalm, and when he didn't know what else to pray, he prayed the 23rd Psalm. It happens to also be my mother's and mine. As he worked his way down south and was able to build himself the equivalent of a little bamboo raft and go into that river, and the river that he said was equivalent to, and Bud Day on the Missouri River, and played out there on the Missouri River, where I've spent a fair amount of time outside of Sioux City. But he said the river was equivalent to the Missouri River at St. Louis. A lot of water. It was flowing fast. When he put into it, he thought that it would be slower than it was. It was flowing more than 7 or 8 miles an hour. That's about what the river flows around up in Sioux City, Iowa today. It took him downstream fast, but he was able to get across the other side, and with arm broken in 3 places and all. And as he emerged from the river, he had to struggle his way through the jungle, starving, hungry, weak from hunger, and he found a cache of U.S. military, we would call them today MREs. And he thought, I found the mother lode of food. Now I can re-energize myself. I can store up with food. I can get my energy back, and I'll be able to go on. But each can that he picked up had been bayoneted, because it was likely U.S. Marines who couldn't carry all of the food with them. They ate their fill. And in that jungle, if you poke a hole in a can, it only takes a little while and that food is spoiled. So it was all spoiled. But he was glad to see that the Marines were following the due diligence and their combat training that they'd had. And throughout this, you'll hear his voice go up in despair, and then he'd check himself and say, what are you complaining about, Bud? It's a great day. The sun came up in a bright way this morning. He's had good weather to speak with, to travel with, and he found a way to find a blessing in thing after thing. If that meant, and he was shelled and escaped death then. U.S. bombs were dropping around him in a close area. He escaped death then. He had to go barefoot across the craters of a bomb field, where some of the sand turns into glass. It cut his feet. His feet were swollen. He was wounded from some of that. And, of course, an arm broken in 3 places. 10 to 12 days he wandered across the desert, always re-navigating, always resetting himself, always disciplining himself to stay on task, stay on task. God is saving you for something. And throughout those days of courage, he was faced multiple times with North Vietnamese regulars and military, North Vietnamese military, that at any slip-up, if he hid in the wrong place, if they looked in the wrong place, if he made a motion, he would have been captured. And outside of Khe Sanh, which was a Marine base about 2 kilometers or perhaps 2 miles from there, Bud Day's luck ran out, and he's encountered by a couple of young North Vietnamese who were either preparing to assault Khe Sanh or trying to assault any supply chains that would be coming to it. And they discovered Bud Day, who then, when he realized he was discovered, now remember, he'd lost about 25 pounds. He went into this weighing about 150. Maybe at this time it's less than 125 pounds. He's weak from hunger. He's eaten frogs and drank some water and a little bit of pulp from a plant, a banana tree that he took apart, and that's about it. So you can imagine how weak he must have been, how wounded he was with a bad knee and an arm broken in 3 places, but he got up to run. And as he ran, he made it a ways. He got through the jungle a ways. But as they shot at him, he took a bullet through the thigh and a bullet through the hand. And he continued to run to evade his captors, who nearly didn't find him. But at the last minute, as they happened to find themselves standing next to him, not realizing it, they captured him. And they captured him, and they pressed him back again and sent him back to Hanoi, to the Hanoi Hilton, where all of these days of disciplining his mind and himself, that resolve that was there, went away, because he lost all of those days and went back into the Hanoi Hilton. This is the man whose spirit held together, and when they began to torture him in an even more sophisticated and even more relentless fashion, they would hang him by his feet for hours. They would beat him with fan belts. And he said that, here's an expression from the 15th chapter of his autobiography, and this chapter is titled Crucifixion. He vividly details the most violent and barbaric tortures he endured. He called them rope tricks. That gives you a sense of Bud Day's sense of humor. Well, they had rope tricks that literally dislocated shoulders and tore muscles, flesh-piercing leg irons, torture cuffs, and kneeling on sharp objects for days on end until the knees became raw, bloody stumps. Beat him with fan belts. And he would pray, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." This is something that I think needs to go into the record verbatim, Mr. Speaker. Bud Day, ever the warrior, prayed, "Jesus, if I survive this nightmare, I will have divine understanding. I am your brother in blood and deed. I am being crucified. I know Satan. I have seen the deepest rings of hell. I am in the pit, Lord, and I am fading. My strength is waning. Give me strength, dear God. Strength. I cannot bear the thought of my wife and our children hearing that I am a traitor. I cannot live in disgrace with my fellow prisoners." Close quote. Can you imagine, Mr. Speaker, the spirit of a man who feared he would disgrace his fellow prisoners? He couldn't bear the thought of becoming a traitor. He couldn't bear the thought of not seeing his beloved wife, Dory, and the kids again. This was Colonel Bud Day. This is the spirit of the man who gave courage and inspiration to all of those in the Hanoi Hilton. And I recall the day we commemorated the statue of Bud Day at the airport in Sioux City, where we got together and named the airstrip after Colonel Bud Day. There's a statue there of Bud Day, and it's a bronze statue that I'll describe in a moment, Mr. Speaker. But Bud Day's defiance to his captors, they would point a rifle at his head and threaten to execute him, and Bud Day would stand there and sing the national anthem. There was another prisoner of war who was first blamed for organizing a prayer session, and a number of them took the oath, that essentially an oath that they would hold their ground and insist that they were going to do prayer sessions. And as the Vietnamese marched them off, the first one to be marched off was beaten and bloodied and being hauled off. And what does Bud Day do? Stood up on his bunk and sang the national anthem at the top of his lungs. And that voice of him singing the national anthem echoed across these cell blocks. They couldn't all see each other, Mr. Speaker, but they could hear. And they echoed it across the cell blocks. They all stood up and sang the national anthem at the top of their lungs. And they asked that prisoner, "What did that make you feel like?" And he said, "It made me feel like I was 9 feet tall, ready to hunt bear with a switch." And the statue of Bud Day that commemorates the Bud Day airstrip in Sioux City is a bronze statue, 9 feet tall. And I remember the day that his twin daughters unveiled that statue from the roof of the airport building, where they pulled the tarp off and showed us the statue of Colonel Bud Day, the man who cheated death time after time after time, the man whom a lot of us wouldn't have believed that would end his life, even that he could cheat nature. I thought he might have been able to do that. I listened to the remarks made by John McCain on the floor of the Senate this Monday. And I was impressed by that delivery, by the poignant moments that John McCain captured. And I would just hit some of those highlights because I think it's so important, and I was so impressed with his presentation. And I think it's very close to the delivery that he gave yesterday and at the service. He said that Bud had his lifetime supplied enough experiences, excitement, and satisfaction for 10 lifetimes. He knew terror and suffering, joy and deliverance. He knew solidarity, self-respect, and dignity. And this is John McCain still. The Vietnamese left me to die in the prison cell Bud shared with Major Norris Overley. Bud and Norris wouldn't let me die. They bathed me, fed me, nursed me, encouraged me, and ordered me back to life. Norris did much of the work because Bud had healing of his own to do, to paraphrase. But to continue the quote, Bud showed me how to save my self-respect and my honor. And that is a debt I can never repay. Close quote from John McCain. Continuing to quote, Bud was a fierce, and I mean really fierce, resistor. He could not be broken in spirit no matter how broken he was in body. He defied men who had the power of life and death over us. To witness him sing the national anthem in response to having a rifle pointed at his face, well, that was something to behold. In 1967, Bud Day, and close quote, Bud Day commanded a squadron of F-100s that served as forward air controllers over Vietnam. They were called the Misties because it was Bud's favorite song. And August 26 of 1967, Bud Day was one of the casualties over Vietnam. And now I want to spend just a moment, now continuing the quote of Senator McCain, Bud was the bravest man I ever knew, and I've known more than a few. He was great company, too, and it made it possible to actually have fun in prison once in a while. Close quote. Extraordinary statement to make, knowing the pain, the agony, and the torture that they all went through there in the Hanoi Hilton in that prisoner of war camp. And so, Mr. Speaker, I want to relate, the Bud Day that I knew. The Bud Day that, we see him here, the Bud Day, the Bud Day of his later years, the happy face, the sparkle in his eyes, that look, that smile. Anybody that knew Bud Day understood this man by looking at this picture. It captured him. It literally and actually captured the real man that was there. This is the Bud Day that I knew. The Bud Day that he loved to hunt and fish, he loved the outdoors, and as busy as he was and as active in his law practice up till the last days of his life, he still made time to go out to the field. He made time to come back to Iowa, South Dakota, that area that he grew up in, that he knew so well and loved so much. He always kept his connections with his home territory. And as we went out in the field year after year and hunted pheasants together primarily, South Dakota and Iowa, I would tell a little narrative. Now, think of this fighter pilot that's been through so much, who could fly up through that valley of death and tell you the narrative of all the anti-aircraft that was being fired at them, and the surface-to-air missiles that were fired at them, and of course, small arms fire that they'd fire at them all constantly. And here's how Bud Day would explain it. It was really exciting. Now, can you imagine a man with the kind of courage that would be facing death by expressing, it was really exciting? And so, this is a man that they loved the outdoors. He loved to hunt. He loved to shoot. And we would put together hunts today, and we'll do another one this fall. Again, it's going to be the Bud Day pheasant hunt. But this is the sparkle in the eye that he always wore the sunglasses out there, but I know this sparkle in his eye. That smile on his face, anybody would know. From there on down, the people that knew Bud Day would smile. If you hold your hand like this and you stretch it out, you'll know that's the action of him stretching the tendons in his injured hand that he did constantly at rest. That hand would always be stretching those tendons back out. And in that ceremony yesterday, there was eulogy after eulogy by other true American heroes, other Medal of Honor recipients, others that flew and fought with him, or part of the Misty Squadron. And the families, the military wives that were there, the people in that room, the 4 stars on shoulders time after time. And as I looked around that room and I saw all that brass, I thought, there are at least enough stars here for a constellation at this funeral. Probably enough for a galaxy if you look at all the people whose lives he touched. And in the 4 legs of my journey down there, in 3 of them, someone approached me and said, "Did you know Bud Day? Are you on the way to the funeral? Are you from the funeral? Here's how he touched my life." And in the last leg of the journey, a young man across the aisle from me asked me if I was on my way back from the funeral. I said yes, and we talked a little bit. I don't know that he knew I'm a member of Congress. And I asked him what he did. He said, "Well, I'm an aviator." And a little bit later, he pulled up a picture of some of the pilots standing there together with Colonel Day in the middle. It was taken most recently within the last couple of years. A great big beaming smile on the face of Bud Day, and those proud pilots all standing in a row. And we exchanged cards as we stepped off the plane. And I put it in my pocket, my front pocket, so I would look at it later, because without my glasses, it's better to shake hands and smile and read it later. When I got home last night, I pulled it out. This man is a Blue Angels pilot, proud and honored to have his picture taken with Colonel Bud Day. And I'm proud and honored to have had the privilege of knowing him, admiring him, stepping up to work to do some to honor him. And the honor that they gave him yesterday, as we went on a 48.1-mile processional from the funeral service to the cemetery in Pensacola, and every mile had mourners standing out there. And for the first 15 or so miles, it was almost shoulder to shoulder. I have never, Mr. Speaker, seen so many flags and umbrellas in the same place in my life. And you would see families, full families, standing there, holding flags, waving them, hands over their hearts. You might see someone in shorts and a T-shirt standing at full salute as the processional went by. Hundreds of cars on the way to the cemetery. And when we entered the cemetery, there stood airmen in full salute for the first leg down through the cemetery, perhaps a half a mile of airmen stretched out. And that's something that grabs your heart. And when we turned the corner, and then it was Marines in full dress, full of salute, all the way down to the burial ceremony. It was something that puts your heart up in your throat and moved people to tears and to emotions that they had not seen all day, by that great, great level of love and appreciation and respect for America up till the moment of his death, America's greatest living hero, Colonel Bud Day. And now, as I've said, I've had the privilege to walk the Iowa and South Dakota, but the Iowa cornfields with Bud Day, and to hunt and to shoot and to stop and rest and talk philosophy and history and politics and what we need to do. I want to put into the record, Mr. Speaker, that the rallies that we did here to battle Obamacare were inspired by Bud Day on top of one of the bluffs up in Plymouth County, Iowa, where he said, call everybody into the Capitol, surround the place, jam the place, don't let anybody in, don't let anybody out. You just get so many people there that say, keep your hands off my health care, they'll have to give up. That was Bud Day. That brought tens of thousands of people here. But in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I want to put John McCain's description of heaven into the record, because I see it the same way. I'm glad he said it. I'm glad he wrote it. He said, speaking of Bud Day, Colonel Bud Day, but he's gone now to a heaven I expect he imagined would look like an Iowa cornfield in early winter, filled with pheasants. This, Mr. Speaker, is a shot, I believe, of the last hunt in Iowa as Colonel Bud Day walked off the field, taken by my youngest son, Jeff, who did so because he wanted to commemorate that moment, fearing that it might be the last time. And so, as I look at this picture of Colonel Bud Day, America's greatest hero, Medal of Honor recipient, 70-some other medals, every combat medal available to him in 3 wars, serving our country, giving us care, giving us inspiration to battle Obamacare, with a smile on his face and a glint in his eye and a sense of humor and a way to express that extraordinary life that he lived. John McCain said, as I do, I will hunt the field with him again. God bless his life. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman.